And so, let's kind of go a little bit farther along with that. And that is, he talks about this arguments with process concept. And, we've been kind of unpacking that a little bit, but this is really kind of the next iteration of that, the arguments with the process by enacting the process. And what's your understanding of that?
The game that came to mind for me was Will Wright's Spore.
Mm,
He really wanted from the very beginning, this designer Will Wright. He's the one who created The Sims, you probably know.
mhm,
But he wanted to teach people about kind of the conflict between evolution and natural selection, and really just how life in the cosmos may have developed and expanded. So he had this it started with a book for him. He wanted to make an argument about how life began and how it spread through the universe, or at least one theory of that,
mhm,
that topic. And then he created a game where players kind of interrogate those ideas through play without
mhm,
even really realizing that they're learning. So he's making an argument about, how life might have expanded, um, almost very, very subtly. He doesn't come out and say, "Oh, here's a theory about how where life may have come from in the
mhm,
universe." Um, but so that's one example. You know, uh, just whatever logic and rules you put into a game or a simulation usually has some kind of meaning. Someone had to make that choice. Until we have artificial intelligence, which when the games start creating themselves, which
right.
they will eventually, but until that time, they're conscious choices about rules, logic, content, how variables fit together, and
Mhm,
those are, whether blatantly or not, they're making some kind of argument, I think.
mhm, mhm. And this kind of is the underpinnings of trying to insert I'm trying to, hold on, I'm just blanking on the word. It's I'll cut this out in the edit. Um,
Oh, don't
learning
cut it out,
objectives,
man.
learning objectives.
We're all
Yeah.
human.
Yeah. Put my humanity back into the conversation, into learning objectives. That's what I'm trying to get to, because what you did is that you really did a nice illustration of talking about how he had an objective. He had something he wanted to teach in that moment. And his learning objective really was reflected in that moment. And, as students are thinking about their own game designs, this is a great place to start thinking about, from a philosophical, but from also a very practical perspective about how to interject that learning objective into your game design.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a
yeah,
great point. With any kind of learning, they talk about games and education as being learning design. You have to
uh-huh.
start with an objective, and um, which can mean many different things, and depending on the type of game and the subject. But yeah, I would agree. Start with some kind of end in mind in
Yeah,
most
yeah,
cases.
yeah. So now, none of these games exist in a vacuum, right? All of this is stuff that rises up. And I think, we've talked a little bit about, even just an example of Grand Theft Auto, about, in that example, how the game arose from, under people's views of Los Angeles, and how it was based in the initial design conceptions of Pac-Man and that kind of thing. But now let's talk a little bit about this notion of cultural artifacts. And kind of those are two examples of cultural artifacts in there. But in Bogost, he talks a little bit about, how those cultural impact artifacts, excuse me, find their way into the game through the design process. And let's unpack that for a second. How do you understand that?
Uh, I thought about this the last time I taught this course. One of the games that the students came up with as a group project was to expose players to traditional Chinese musical instruments. It was a passion of theirs. They're instruments you don't see very often except in traditional ceremony. And they wanted to create almost like a Guitar Hero kind of game, but using traditional instruments. So, I thought that was fantastic. And it was something that as a player, you would suddenly be exposed to this aspect of culture that you didn't know before. So that's a game that's rooted in a particular,
Mhm.
cultural setting and environment and content. I also, we talked, I don't think anybody actually did this, but I talked to the class about the idea when we discussed this, as imagine if you created a game about what it's like to be a international graduate student at Johns Hopkins. And you created the game as this, you take your experience of what it was like to apply, to interview, to come here, to, you know, get housing, to learn the system, you know, turn that into some sort of simulation that then students who are thinking about applying for an international program could play, learn about. So they would be exposed to this cultural experience, some of the challenges the students may have faced, and learning about this, you know, the Johns Hopkins environment, or any university really. So those are just a couple of ideas. Anything that that exposes the player or the person, you know, using the simulation to something culturally relevant to the designer. That's kind of how I see it.
And, you know, would you say that also, I was like, you've been thinking about this, and I've also been thinking about how this plays into genre a little bit, and specifically, you know, for the students who are interested in horror as a genre, one of the interesting things about horror is that's always a reflection of the current zeitgeist fear of a community. So when you see horror films being generated, I'm thinking of, you know, students probably too young for this, but there's an old movie called Rosemary's Baby about somebody who has this demon growing, and this woman who has a demon baby growing inside of her, and the fear of that came out of a fear of something called thalidomide, which was this drug that women were taking when they were pregnant that were causing birth defects. And you know, there's also been this resurgence in the zombie genre right now of, you know, I think of The Walking Dead and Fear of the Walking Dead, and all of the, you know, The Evil Dead and all of that stuff, where you have, you know, large hordes against individuals, and how that's playing into the current fear structure and what we internalize as a community. And, you know, when I think about culture artifacts, I think there's also specific culture artifacts that you just get a beautiful example of with the instruments, and I love that. And I think there's also kind of the mentality that the again, I keep coming back to this word zeitgeist. You know what I mean? This notion of what do we as a community hold as our central values, and how do we interject that into the game?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen examples of teachers who are in media literacy, who are creating games, simulations to help students recognize bias in media, and how to weed out conspiracy theories from social media and that kind of thing. That's you know, that perfectly matches with your concept of the zeitgeist and trying to address cultural issues as they are today.
Yeah. Well, so let's kind of take it home here. And, you know, one of the things that I would really love to get your perspective of is Bogost states that if video games have any purpose in schools, because we're talking about schools here, it is supplementing or replacing lesson plans for concrete factual learning, such as principles as chemistry. And, you know, that really struck me as that's a pretty bold statement. And, you know, would you agree with that, you know?
No, but I have to say, I think he's actually saying the opposite of that.
Okay. Yeah,
if you
please.
look at it closely, because I think what he's saying is that that's how the games have typically and traditionally been looked at. But I think his argument is that that's not the way they should be, that it actually should be looked at more of a type of expression similar to a book, or if you look at, I'm trying to think exactly what he says, but it should be thought of in a similar way to literature or history, or something that you use to reflect rather than to just teach content. Teaching content is not something games do great. I mean, you look at maybe math games where the kids learning multiplication tables, and they get one right, and ooh, fireworks go off. I mean, that's how a lot of games have traditionally, or maybe it's the periodic table, and you have to match the elements to the name, the abbreviation to the name. Those are games. Maybe they help to teach a concept, but I think what he's saying is the more powerful use of games is if they're used much more broadly than that. You play them, then you reflect on them, you interrogate them, you think about what choices you made and why, or what a
Mm,
student learned from that experience. So I think it was just a little confusing the way he said that, but that was my read
yeah.
on what he's trying to say.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I appreciate you unpacking that for us. And I think you're absolutely right. It's all these can be used in conjunction with other learning styles, right? This is the essence of differentiated instruction, right? Where you have different modalities of delivering content to students in a way that absorbs them and they kind of feel engaged with the learning materials. And games are one avenue amongst a myriad of other options in that moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. All right, well, that's the end of this particular one. Thank you so much, Dave. Really appreciate it. That's Ian Bogost, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, everybody.